let's nuke the moon. It was just so bizarre, but I think it speaks to sort of getting stuck into systems that you can't get out of again. And there's an internal logic that gets going that it makes sense if you're in that boardroom in the 60s and people are talking about things like the complete end of all life on planet Earth and this menace that is completely unreasonable and unwilling to talk and negotiate and basically hates humanity as such. Just logically, it boggles the mind. I mean, if you kill everything on planet Earth, yes, you get rid of communists, but at what cost?
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today on the podcast, I have Nathan Radke and Lee Kuhlne, 2/3 of the podcast, The Uncover-Up. Nathan is a cultural theory professor with a specialty in conspiracy theory, and Lee is a politics professor specializing in political ideologies. Both of them are at Humber College in Toronto, Canada. With that background, you can imagine how interesting their podcast is to listen to, and there is no shortage of conspiracy theories for them to analyze. The Uncover-Up podcast is really well done and entertaining. They dig deep into a particular theory and tease out the truth using logic, reason, and a whole lot of research. They cover a wide variety of topics from classics like UFOs, the Bermuda Triangle, and monster sightings to more modern theories like 9/11, QAnon, and celebrity deaths. But to get you started, I've linked 3 episodes I think, if you're a listener to this show, you would like in the show notes. The first is Doomsday Devices. Next is Alien and UFOs, what was really going on in Area 51. And the third one will show up in our conversation during this episode. Find even more episodes of The Uncover-Up wherever you listen to podcasts. One of the first things I do when researching topics for My Nuclear Life is to search that topic or guest in a podcast search engine. It was there I first found The Cover-Up. I don't remember what set of words brought up their unique UFO cover art, but after I listened to one episode, they unknowingly had a new best friend. So I was delighted when Lee and Nathan agreed to come on My Nuclear Life and talk about the intersection of our 2 shows. You will hear from our conversations. Nathan and Lee are really fun to talk to and extremely knowledgeable in a wide variety of topics. But I have no idea how they stay sane. When I started looking into just one government project, there were so many rabbit holes I wanted to go down that I drove myself a bit crazy. In this episode, we discuss a wide range of topics, mostly revolving around nuclear weapons and the Cold War, including why we are also obsessed with Cold War projects and conspiracy theory. I have a personal question, which is, why do you do so many UFO episodes?
There's a couple reasons for that. One is that we're in the midst of a UFO flap right now. This month, June of 2021, the Pentagon has to come out with a report after years and years of trying to deny that there were any kind of UFOs in American airspace. There were a few videos leaked out, and eventually the Pentagon admitted, yeah, these videos are legitimate. And so now this sort of question that sort of comes in and out of fashion. It's like a cicada. It comes back every 20 years or so. And right now, we're probably in the midst of one of the largest UFO flaps in modern history. And personally, obviously, it gives me an excuse to talk about Cold War airplanes anytime we do a UFO episode. Another reason is that we have a lot of students who listen to the podcast. And interestingly, the students are amongst the most interested in UFO content.
Do you know why? Why are they most interested in UFO content?
I think part of it is that, if we look at when UFOs become popular, they become popular in the 1950s at a time of great terror about Cold War nuclear annihilation. They show up in the 70s when people are losing faith in institutions and government. They show up in the 90s when you've had events like Waco or Ruby Ridge, where again, you start to see this kind of paranoia seep in. And I think that this generation, the generation of our students, because they're 18, 19 years old, they've spent their whole life in a world that the future already seems to be preempted because of imminent environmental catastrophes, because of just sort of runaway consumerism. I think that they're under a level of stress that maybe we don't appreciate as much as we should. And I think it's at those times when you see something like UFOs become more interesting, because it almost becomes a kind of wish fulfillment. Because now it's like, oh, wait, maybe there's something out there. Maybe there's something wiser than us. Maybe there's something better than us. Or if you're a bit more cynical, maybe there's something that's going to come down and just wipe us all out completely because we've earned it and deserve it.
For me, I just want to add to what Nathan says about why is it that we create so many of these episodes. For me, I just find it epistemically really interesting. I get really interested in the debris and the garbage of mainstream academic culture. Like, what is the stuff that is just stupid, not worth investigating? And I've actually ended up weirdly spending my life in these margins. And I found it's so interesting. There's so much I find that's revealed both in our own psychology, in our ideologies, in when we get things wrong, when we misinterpret it, and just the UFO phenomenon. There's just so much stuff there that I'm just drawn to every time. A mix of other people, agencies, governments trying to spread disinformation. So, how that kind of flack and confusion is part of the equation. How then the government, the American government in some instances, is using it as a cover for things. How it plays into pop culture and how we then project those ideas, how we interpret stuff. Why are we interpreting this phenomenon as aliens and not angels or something besides? And for me, it always gets personal in some way. And so I personally thought that there was nothing worth talking or thinking about when it came to UFOs. And so for me to have traversed that, like, oh, this is just a dumb subject, why talk about it, to, oh my God, we can learn so much about humanity and what's going wrong and who we are, that I've just love it. Like, I just keep coming back and I keep learning more. And Nathan surprised me a few days ago by dropping in my mailbox another 4 or 5 books on the UFO phenomenon. And I'm like, I can't wait because I'm just about to finish the last set you dropped off. It's becoming an obsession. My background is more political conspiracies. Certainly that's where my training is more rooted. But, well, not even, but the political conspiracies are almost secondary now for me. Elena, who's the third person on our podcast, she's the one most interested in pop culture, famous people, the death of Princess Diana, Marilyn Monroe. And so we each have our own little interests that we bring to it. But I just find what the UFOs tell us about ourselves and our culture is just so endlessly fascinating.
And I will say that I started listening to your podcast and I skipped every single UFO one because Lee, like you, I was just like, oh, not another UFO podcast. But once I started listening to your podcast and realizing that it wasn't what I thought your podcast was, then I started going back and listening to the UFO ones, that it wasn't just a conspiracy podcast that was feeding into conspiracies, but actually looking at the root of conspiracies and explaining them. Then I started going back and listening to them.
For me, I've gone back and listened to the entire set myself. And I listened all the way through. And the ones we've done on the UFOs, especially I think it was 2 summers ago, stand out as my favorite. And I think that's also why we've started to come back to them again. Because I figured once we did like 5 or 6, we were done and we could move on. But apparently not.
Yeah, like Lee says, the thing about conspiracy theories is that we can learn about them regardless of whether they're true or not. What we learn changes. when we learn about a true conspiracy, we learn obviously about history and we learn about the dangers of runaway power and things like that. That's when you get into your MK Ultras or your COINTELPROs, these sort of large agency operations that genuinely existed. But when you find conspiracies that aren't true, then they teach us something about ourselves and why we believe them. What is the wish fulfillment there? Or what are the fears? What are the prejudices? So regardless of whether a conspiracy theory is true or not, the fact that it exists and it circulates in our society tells us so much. And this is a point that I used to have to kind of fight other academics on, because conspiracy theory wasn't considered something that was worth studying. I think those days are far behind us now. I think that the events, some of the tragic events of the last few years have indicated the vital importance in studying conspiracy theory as a behavioral motivator. Because we have seen everything from the attack on the Capitol back in January to vaccine hesitancy. All of these basically have been driven to a degree by conspiracy. And when we go back in history, we can find even more horrifying events that ultimately have conspiracy in the mix.
And so, Nathan, you mentioned that you like talking about the Cold War. Is this one of your favorite topics to talk about?
If I was a superhero and I had an origin story, here's my very brief origin story.
Yes, please.
6-year-old Nathan is watching TV in the middle of the day. It's a movie called Dr. Strangelove. Of course, I'm sure the listeners know, but Dr. Strangelove is kind of this absurdist tale about the dangers of the logic of mutually assured destruction. And of course, there is that famous scene where you have Slim Pickens the cowboy. He's been flying his B-52. He's jumping up and down on this bomb, trying to get it to release. It releases, and he falls down with it and waves his cowboy hat and says, Yahoo. So I'm watching that at 6 years old, and I'm entranced by this scene. Yahoo! Yahoo! Suddenly, my mom comes into the room, sees what's on the TV, does the math, realizes that I'm 6, runs across the room and turns off the TV at the second before the bomb goes off. Now, I can understand why she did that. She was trying to protect me. Of course, it had the exact opposite, because then, of course, my imagination just thought, there must have been something so horrifying, so terrible after that moment that my mom wouldn't let me see it. Like, I became sort of obsessed with it as a 6-year-old. Later, watching Saturday morning cartoons, those cartoons would be interrupted by a beeping noise. This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. And again, I was watching my cartoons that went off, and I asked my mom, so what is this? Is this for like a tornado or something? And she said, no, this is in case there's a nuclear war. And my brain made that connection with the Dr. Strangelove scene. And then I spent all of grade 1 riding the bus on my way to school, looking at the window, imagining mushroom clouds on the horizon. Although, of course, my school in Orangeville, Ontario would not have been a target of nuclear weapons, probably. And so, yeah, as a kid, I became so curious about this. As I grew older and my academic pursuit turned to things like logic, then it was the internal logic of the Cold War that had me so fascinated. This kind of system, which from the inside, it would make perfect sense, but from the outside seemed like absolute absurdity and folly. How did we get to the situation where we were in this place where we were always imminently about to be destroyed? How did we reason ourselves to there?
It's a strategy that makes sense if no one else is involved.
True. The mutually assured destruction, you mean?
Yeah.
Sure. There's like a weird kind of stability to it.
So, Nathan, you developed this conspiracy class at your university, and then Lee, you started teaching it later. Is that the way it worked out?
Yeah, I was teaching it for a couple of years. I noticed that whenever I was trying to teach something like sociology or philosophy, inevitably there'd be a large percentage of the student body who would say, well, what about the Illuminati? Don't they just control everything? And I would say, this is outside of my understanding. I don't know what this Illuminati is that you speak of. And so I started to look into that because, again, it was sort of student-driven. And then that's when it started to appeal to my logic training, because here were arguments that I could dissect. Here were arguments that I could sort of analyze and evaluate. And then I discovered, much to my horror, that there were a lot of conspiracy theories that sounded bizarre, that sounded like they had to be made up, that were actually accurate. The one that Lee and I often talk about, of course, is something like Operation Midnight Climax, in which the CIA hired sex trade workers to seduce men in bars to bring them back to hotel rooms that were actually safe houses with trick mirrors, and then they would dose those men with LSD and then record them as part of MKUltra.
You can't make this stuff up. The kind of stuff that we've discovered in doing this is mind-boggling, and it's really, the stuff that's true is more surprising and scary than a lot of the conspiracy theories. I mean, one of the things that we try and do on the podcast, but more so in class, is to talk about the tools we would use to analyze these conspiracy theories. Again, this sort of epistemic question, like, you don't have enough information, but you have to act now. You have to make a decision. Are you going to get vaccinated or not? Are you going to vote or not? And depending on what you believe, that's going to obviously influence you greatly, but we don't always have enough information. My go-to example for my students is always, look, they're not going to let me into Area 51, unlike some people. They're not going to let me in, so I can't go look around. I can't go to the moon and see if this is doable. And yet, the conceit is that you don't need to experience it yourself necessarily. There are tools that we have available to us that will allow us to dissect these things and kind of understand them. But in doing that, I've been shocked so many times where on the face of it, I can give you two conspiracies and say, in one, the government tried to ignite the atmosphere, and in the other, something else. And it turned, guess which one is the real one, right? And it's so shocking, all of the shenanigans that have happened, that we are still here, that we still exist after playing with nuclear bombs and accidentally dropping them and losing them and setting them off or not. But also, just to your earlier point, Shelly, Nathan is the one who developed the course. I came on board to teach it later. And I'm going to make a similar point to what Nathan said, but just slightly differently, because Nathan will not speak to his underlying genius here. And I say this with some resentment, that he is a truly brilliant teacher, because after I did my coursework and had graduate degrees, and I was coming in, I was like, all right, let's do some work. And I was not communicating with the students. I mean, I was just talking in a different language. I was not actually teaching. And part of the problem was I was not meeting them even halfway. I wanted to talk to them about the tools at our disposal to understand the world, and that's good enough, but I was not addressing the problems or their interests. I would be talking, and like Nathan said, you get these bizarre comments that, again, just speak to the fact that we're inhabiting different universes. And once I started to teach this course, it was maybe the first time that I understood how I could make my training relevant. I could use the kinds of tools that I had discovered that really work well in helping me navigate complex social questions. And I was able to make that relevant in their world with their interests. And things that, again, Nathan is very prescient in things like this. When I started in the course, it really seemed like this was a kind of a youth subculture reaction to the mainstream, a kind of like some disaffected minority of young people were sort of flipping the proverbial bird to mainstream society and being like, you guys don't know anything. But as we were doing it more, in fact, they were just the harbingers of a much larger cultural movement that sort of exploded, I think, into public consciousness sometime in the last 5 years, maybe with the 2016 American election. That's when conspiracies start to enter mainstream discourse, and just got bigger since then. And so now we're really well placed to talk about it. But at first it was our interest in it, certainly mine in joining this course that was already developed and later, was just to see how I could talk to students in a new way about the stuff that I cared about, but in a way that made sense to their lives.
Secretly, the course is kind of a Trojan horse, because we can bring the students in with like, oh, we're going to talk about the CIA, we're going to talk about the FBI, we're going to look at the history of the Illuminati and 9/11. We're going to talk about all these things, but then hidden in that course are critical thinking skills and logic. And I hope that the way we teach it also promotes things like sympathy and empathy, because ultimately, I think the way we see this course is that we're doing our tiny little bit to try to prevent horror. And because we've seen historically how either there can be a genuine conspiracy where people in power are up to no good and that creates horror. Or there is a false conspiracy theory that scapegoats a part of the population being spread, and that can also cause an unbelievable amount of chaos and disaster. It's like, we say you are what you eat. I think it's far more accurate to say you are what you think.
I think that's what makes classes like that so interesting and so rewarding to teach. That you're actually in this collaborative atmosphere with your students and you get so much more out of it as well. And it's not just the students taking away something you learned from them, as well as them learning from you.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we have to do when we go into the classroom is we go in with the attitude of, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a history class. This is a conspiracy class. And so, like, we all together, kind of in a gestalt way, we all have to come together and we all have to dialogue our way through this bizarre situation to try to arrive at something reasonable in a very unreasonable world.
The effect for me has also been to really defang conspiracies and the people who hold them. Before I engaged in this work, I treated conspiratorial thinking much like religious fundamentalism, in the sense that for me personally, I know it's wrong, but I can't be bothered to understand why. Like, I'm not actually going to pick up a Bible and try and argue with somebody about it. I just always wanted to avoid any kind of interaction that was going to work like that. And what I discovered is that, contrary to my prejudices about people who might have these views, they were people who are by and large trying to understand the world. They are social theorists without good theory, not idiots who are aggressively trying to make us all dumber. That is, again, I'm connecting again with Nathan's point. For me, it wasn't just that I came to the class with empathy, it's that I actually developed it in teaching it, because I came to understand fellow seekers who have been led astray in a way, and in ways that also I could see happening with me as well. If I look back in my own intellectual biography, I could see how these things have influenced me, have gotten me off of the straight and narrow path, and how difficult it actually is to really develop these tools and implement them without somebody taking you by the hand and showing it to you.
And I found that when teaching undergraduate students, that we expect so much advanced thinking from them, but we've never taught them to think in this advanced way. But there's exactly that disconnect, because how are they supposed to develop it if we don't teach them to develop it?
And the students that we have now, they're like, we have to look at them as cyborgs. They were born into a world of information. They were born into a world where they are never more than maybe 3 feet away from their phone, if that. When we were young, it was a question of, we just can't get enough information. There's been an abrupt shift where the students we have now, the problem is not that they don't have enough information. The problem is that they are standing in front of an open fire hydrant of information, and it is just unloading itself all up in their face, constantly.
Yeah, it's just too much, and not all of it's good.
Yeah, the ratio is not leaned in favor of good information, I would say.
You have a few episodes on the intersection, basically, of our two podcasts, which are nuclear science or nuclear weapons and conspiracy theories. And there were a lot of projects during the Cold War that involved weapon security or nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviets. And a lot of them were conspiracy theories or had roots in conspiracy theory. Can you tell me a few of them?
Oh, sure. I mean, the Cold War, because of mutually assured destruction, because the two countries didn't have the capability of just having open conflict, they had to fight in these bizarre, surreptitious, covert ways, which, of course, lent itself completely to a conspiratorial outlook. And some of the stuff that we've come across, a lot of the weirdest stuff is nuclear in origin. One of the ones that early on I sprung on Lee was Project A119, which, of course, was the American plan in the late 1950s to nuke the moon.
Oh, yes.
Which is another one of those ones that when you hear about it, and of course I'm saying it in kind of a ridiculous way, But it's one of those ones that when you first hear about it, you're like, well, that one can't be true. But then you look at the files and you see that Carl Sagan was involved, and you look at the internal logic behind it, and you're like, oh, nope, I could totally see them thinking that over. I could totally imagine a situation where there's a bunch of people sitting in a room, they're brainstorming, and one of them says, well, I've got an idea. What if we nuked the moon? And then everyone else sort of nods and says, go on. That's one of the less horrifying ones because it didn't actually follow through with it.
So I have a question about that one.
Of course.
I heard, no source attached to this, that President Kennedy was given two options to beat the Soviets. One was nuking the moon, and the other was putting a man on the moon. And he chose putting a man on the moon. But nuking the moon was an option given to him.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's absolutely true, especially when you consider that at that point in the late 50s, the American space program, despite the fact that during Project Paperclip they had grabbed a bunch of German World War II scientists, the American space program was pretty far behind the Soviet one. And the Soviets had a lot of early successes, and the Americans had a lot of early failures. And again, because you couldn't fight directly, you had to fight symbolically. And so you'd fight in the Olympics. You'd say, oh, my guy ran faster, therefore capitalism's better. Or, yeah, but our guy jumped higher, so communism's better. But the space race was sort of the greatest proxy for the Cold War because, I mean, for one thing, it was so public and it was so technologically driven. And just practically speaking, if you can put a person into orbit and bring them safely down, you could probably also send a nuclear warhead into orbit and bring that down into the heart of your enemy's city. So it was such a good metaphor in general. What's fascinating is when you watch those speeches with Kennedy talking about putting a man on the moon, it has almost nothing to do with exploration. It has almost nothing to do with, oh, let's learn what's out there, and everything to do with the world is watching us. We can't let the Soviets get there before us, or people will think that they are better. Absolutely extraordinary.
So, Lee, how did you respond when you heard we wanted to nuke the moon?
That became a saying for me, actually, for a couple of months after that. Whenever I thought somebody was going to say something ridiculous, I would shout out, let's nuke the moon. It was just so bizarre, but I think it speaks to sort of getting stuck into systems that you can't get out of again. And there's an internal logic that gets going that it makes sense if you're in that boardroom in the 60s and people are talking about things like the complete end of all life on planet Earth and this menace that is completely unreasonable and unwilling to talk and negotiate and basically hates humanity as such. How these systems of logic sort of take on a life of their own, and you get yourself sucked into things like considering whether setting the atmosphere on fire, nuking the moon, or any kind of other really absurd and ridiculous. I mean, it just logically, it boggles the mind. I mean, if you kill everything on planet Earth, yes, you get rid of communists, but at what cost? And I think this had a deeper impact on me than I realized at the time, because it did start to reawaken something that felt familiar. It was a familiar feeling that came back, and it was that Cold War fear. And it was something that had just disappeared. You know, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, the good guys won, we pat ourselves on the back, let's all go off and make some money.
Let's all wear blue jeans and listen to David Hasselhoff and
exactly.
Whatever it takes.
The 90s are here, we won, it's done. And I kind of still felt like that there were adults in the room, and then they would take care of the mess. Like, we would disarm and get rid of the bombs in some safe way, and we would kind of retreat to more conventional warfare. Not that doesn't have its own horrors, but I sort of forgot about the Cold War and what it meant and that fear. And what I started to discover with stuff like this, with just the cavalier nature in which you could suggest doing something just utterly catastrophic, it reawakened in me that sense of how close to the brink we are as a civilization. So yeah, things got scarier for me, but sorry to go so dark so early, but
we're talking about nuclear war.
We start dark. It's always this question of, because we're so intelligent, human beings, like, look at all the stuff that they've done. I mean, we've got the internet, and we've got portable lighters, and we've got the wheel, and like we've got
portable
sandwiches.
lighters? Really? Like, you're going to go from the internet to portable lighters to the...
If you want to impress a caveman, you pull out a portable lighter.
Yeah.
How many cavemen do you know?
True.
Look at the story of Prometheus. Look at how much trouble Prometheus got into for giving us fire, and now we can just carry it around in our pocket. We are like gods with our portable lighters. But I digress.
Okay. Not the airplane.
I mean, those are fine too. Right, so we have all this amazing intelligence, but the question always is, do we have the wisdom to survive our intelligence? We have the intelligence. We can do these things. And that's what intelligence is all about. It's about technology and problem solving. Can we do something? But the question is, do we have the wisdom to be able to live through that and ask the question, okay, but should we do something? What are the implications of our actions? And again, we see these amazing displays of intelligence from us, from the humans. Project Pluto, which was a nuclear-powered hypersonic missile. So it would actually have a nuclear engine, which means that theoretically this thing could fly for like a really, really long time at a really high speed. And it would be filled with nuclear bombs as well. So it would be flying around at like Mach 5, at basically treetop level, dropping atomic bombs on things.
What could possibly go wrong?
But I mean, you got to admit, it takes some cleverness to build that.
Did they build it?
No, they spent billions on it. This was early 60s. They did spend billions on this program, and they got to the point of developing the engines, and were testing the engines on the ground. But they never got to the point of actually building this thing. But that's the ultimate example to me of the combination of extreme intelligence to be able to create something like this, and a complete lack of wisdom to say, wait, this is literally the worst idea anyone has ever had in history.
I don't know if that's the worst idea anyone has
it's gotta be
ever
up there.
had in history. Project Seesaw.
Oh, Project Seesaw. Okay, now we're getting into it.
That's gotta be the worst idea.
That is one of the worst ideas I had ever heard. In fact, it's such a terrible idea. It's such a terrifying idea. It's such an absurd idea that it has to become an episode of The Uncover Up, I would say.
I agree.
And because it's going to be dealing with a lot of things that Lee and I have absolutely no comprehension of, I believe, Shelly, that you should probably come on and help us.
That'd be awesome. Can we give a teaser? Can we just give sort of a one-line Project Seesaw was going to... Or you have to tune into The Uncover Up.
I'll give the elevator pitch. Okay, so obviously you don't want nuclear missiles raining down on your country. That's an issue. With a bomber, you could shoot down a bomber. There's some hope there. But if it's an intercontinental ballistic missile, you can't intercept them, you can't shoot them down. What could you do? What if you built a giant particle ray gun that you could then use to just sort of incinerate the missiles as they're coming in? Well, I mean, that's theoretically possible.
It's a great idea.
It's a fantastic idea, but Shelly, where are you going to get the energy to power something like that?
Maybe hydropower?
Oh, sure, hydropower. I mean, we're pretty close to Niagara Falls. I mean, that might sort of come close. We're going to need more hydro than Niagara Falls. So what could we do?
There's some Great Lakes around.
Those are Great Lakes. We're both sort of living by them. That's a lot of water.
That's a lot of water.
That's genius. What if... Now, follow me here. What if we built these giant underground tunnels, and then when the moment arrived that the missiles were headed for our country, we blew the bottom out of the lakes, drained all the lakes in like a couple minutes, and used that to power a massive hydro station, which we could then use to fire up our particle gun.
I see nothing wrong with that plan.
We did it! We figured it out! Yay!
This is it, man. This is just the insanity of humanity. And it comes out in these weird stories. This is what you don't get this in the sort of the high history of leading political figures. You don't see how often we came to completely annihilating ourselves, how these unsung heroes, who each of whom should get a statue in every city on earth, stopped the bomb by disobeying orders. And I'm just flabbergasted. I just needed to pipe in and tell you guys that.
I've been flabbergasted many times by the ideas that DARPA came up with during the Cold War as far as missile defense. As a nuclear scientist, some of them, I'm like, well, that's possible, but why would you do it? Like, why?
One of my favorite DARPA ones, it's not as big as draining all the Great Lakes and firing off a massive particle cannon. In fact, it isn't even nuclear, but I do want to bring it up very briefly.
Yeah.
DARPA was working on a scheme whereby you could spray an enemy combatant with like a kind of pheromone, which would cause them to be attacked by bees.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That is kind of cool.
Yep, that one's not bad.
I mean, who comes up with... I don't know why they didn't just hire a bunch of comic book writers, because a lot of the projects are straight out of they're comic book villain schemes.
Yeah.
I think if I read it in a comic book, I'd be like, wait, that's too much even for a comic book.
Yeah.
Like, your evil genius is going to nuke the moon? Come on.
Yeah.
Drain the Great Lakes? Whatever.
Yeah.
Like, be realistic.
Yeah, exactly. But nope, the U.S. government gave billions of dollars to do these things.
Now, Shelly, you started by talking about the intersection of our podcast, sort of conspiracies and the bomb. And I think there's a lot more in the direction of where Nathan was going, just in terms of direct conspiracies about the bomb or blowing things up or about missile defense. I was thinking about it, though, in a slightly different way, which is that a lot of other conspiracies make sense in the Cold War because the bomb is in the background. The bomb is the backdrop that makes all these other conspiracies kind of scary and dangerous, because our opponents are the Soviets, and they're doing this in order to either sabotage our ability to use the bomb or in order to make it easier for them to use the bomb. I just finished a book a little while ago called The Mitrokhin Archive, which is absolutely fascinating. It's a story in and of itself where the head archivist of the KGB is, for 20 more years, he's squirreling away in his holiday home all the top secret stuff. They did some massive bureaucratic reclassification, so we had to open all the documents and then reseal them with this new number. And so we got to read stuff, and he made copious copies. And then he is exfiltrated, I think is the word they used for it, which is that he was sort of snuck out of the Soviet Union already in its period of collapse. He combines with an academic, Christopher Andrew, and they write this almost 1,000-page tome of all the operations that the KGB was engaged in, at least that they know of from this KGB archivist's data. And it was just an ongoing litany of operations with varying degrees of success and intensity and money spent, of infiltrating the United States with spies in all areas, of creating disinformation campaigns, of trying to undermine American society from within while also creating images of American society in the international press that were very unfavorable. And all of this had the bomb in the background, much like the space race. Nathan was making the argument that the space race was really a saber-rattling exercise to show American missile might, rocket might. Like, we can do this. It's so accurate. We can get here. We can definitely get to Moscow with a bomb strapped to this. So a lot of the Cold War shenanigans, I feel like, only make sense because of the backdrop of the bomb.
Yeah, actually, I have an example that this is one of Lee's favorites, and I think maybe this will put a hat on the whole episode. It's one of those, exactly as Lee says, that it has the bomb in the background. This isn't about nuclear power, but it's because of nuclear power. Because they had to find unorthodox ways to fight. One of the main ways they did that is through disinformation. But the most extraordinary thing happened with something called Project Stargate. Now, what happened with Stargate was the Americans were trying to conceal the fact that they had a new ultra-low frequency transmitter that they could use to communicate with submarines deep in the ocean. They needed to figure out how to cover that. So they planted a fake story in a French newspaper about how they were using psychics to communicate with submarines. And then, because then the American government was like, oh, this is brilliant. We're going to fool the Soviets into spending a fortune on psychics. It's great. And it sort of worked because then the Soviets started spending a lot of money on psychic research. But then the Air Force and the CIA were like, wait a second. The Soviets are spending a lot of money on psychic research. We better spend some money on psychic research too.
Did they forget that they started this?
Yeah, there was a time lag of like 30 years where the Americans start this operation. And, people retire and move on and get promoted and stuff like that. But the Soviets are just keep going, They're like, we better close this psychic gap, so get on weaponizing psychics. And then later, spies and others start to reveal that this is what the Soviets are doing. So the next generation of whoever CIA analysts are like, we better get on this. And they get Uri Geller.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't have documentation for this, but I have come across the suggestion that maybe Geller was actually an Israeli spy and that he was using this to infiltrate the Americans. But one way or the other, Uri Geller totally fools American CIA analysts into believing that psychic phenomena is a legit thing until one of my heroes, the Amazing Randy, the magician.
The Amazing Randy, of course.
The Amazing Randy, he's like, this guy's bogus, and writes a book exposing Geller and the whole shenanigans. But all of this only makes sense, I feel like, because we have the discourse of global nuclear annihilation. And I just recently came across again this expression popularized by Carl Sagan that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I feel like in the same way in politics, extraordinary starting conditions or extraordinary threats maybe allow for extraordinary solutions. And so I don't think you would have gotten funding they were funded quite nicely, like we, with our piddly little research grants, would be very envious of the millions of dollars that were thrown at trying to weaponize psychics. But I don't think anybody would have been willing to cough up funding for such an obviously ridiculous thing if the threat was not so serious. Because, not that you would have to explain it to anybody if you were the victim of a large-scale nuclear attack, but I think that was the fear. That fear, what is it that Colin Powell said in the UN speech, right? That the smoking gun is a mushroom cloud. That there's going to be just this awful event, and we were just sitting on our hands, not taking things too seriously, so it's probably bogus, but let's fund them anyway, just to be sure.
And that's how we ended up with a bunch of Air Force officers sitting in a room trying to kill puppies with their psychic powers. Unsuccessfully.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
In this podcast, puppies always live.
Yeah. Well, actually, and then I won't get into it. It's too bizarre even to get into now.
I have to know now, as long as the puppies live.
Oh, yeah, the puppies are fine. But they realize that it's not working. There are no Air Force officers who seem to be able to murder puppies just with the power of their psychic abilities. And so they think, well, there's two possibilities here. Either this whole thing is absurd and ridiculous and ill-conceived from the start.
That can't be it. So what's number two?
No, that can't be it. It's got to be something else. Puppies are really cute. It's hard to want to kill a puppy. And so they replace the puppies with goats. Because goats, if you've ever seen a goat, they kind of look like they're trying to kill you with their mind.
Absolutely.
You might have heard this book by John Ronson, The Men Who Stare at Goats.
It's a movie with, what's his name in it? George Clooney.
Yeah. And the tragedy of that movie is that it's a little bit more accurate than you would hope.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, that's horrible.
Again, the theme of today, I'm surprised we survived too.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So how do you explain to your students the threat of the Cold War? Like, how do you explain to them how scary it was for people during that time that justified spending all this money?
We're very fortunate to have access to all this old footage and things like that. And so what I'll do is I will show them the entirety of Duck and Cover, which sort of gets them into the mood. Imagine you're a little kid, you go to school, and then you're told this. There's that amazing footage of they take 3 houses, one messy, one sort of tidy, and one super clean, and then they detonate an atomic bomb, And to show it's like, well, the dirty house catches fire immediately, whereas the clean house catches fire eventually. And so that kind of footage can really drive home what the situation was.
That footage pisses me off because, one, the dirty home is cleaner than my house.
Oh, yeah. I know. There's like a newspaper on the table, and they're like, look at the filth.
And two, it's just another way to shame women.
Of course.
It's just so sexist.
Yeah. Way to go, honey. Now all of society's collapsed.
Yeah.
Because you left my newspaper out.
That's right. And my slippers.
And my slippers. You did not clean up after me.
Yeah. And now society's over.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, those are good. Do they get it? I mean, do you show them like the day after, or do you show them threads?
Actually, it's funny. The most effective clip that I show, it looks like an old 1980s video game. It was created by a Japanese artist. And Lee, I think you show the same one. And all it is...
Every time.
And it's amazing what reaction you get from the students. And I'll show it during break. Like, we'll have a 10-minute break. It's a 10-minute video. And I'll just put it on the background. It's a map of the world. And then it just starts with a blip in Los Alamos, and then a blip in Hiroshima, blip in Nagasaki.
And then
blips everywhere. And then Zarbama goes off, and it just silences everything for like a couple seconds because we're all like, whoa, we went too far. And then the French start up, and then everyone else starts up again. So you're, of course, familiar with this video.
Yeah, it's an art piece, actually.
Exactly. Japanese artist.
It's good that helps because, I mean, I have so much to show that I'm curious on what students respond to in your class, because I'm like, oh, I just need to show those three things.
Yeah.
I tend to show one of you both will know which test footage this is, but there's just a civilian house with a couple of pigs in the desert. And so I showed that, as well as from the Atomic Cafe, just one of the bombs blowing up, just like, boom, here. And actually the Bikini Atoll is great because you have the size of the ships next to the mushroom cloud that comes out of the water. And I mean, the ships look smaller than toys next to this mushroom cloud. And then we go on break, and then I show that blip. So you get a sense of the magnitude of it. So that I find helps. But to return to your earlier question, I actually find it's less of a sales job now than it used to be, because a lot of my students are coming to me with a very deep sense of pessimism and fear around climate change. So I feel like 20 years ago, it was still like I had to resuscitate the Cold War for my students as much as myself. It was like, if this subject emerged, it would really be a historical moment. Whereas today, I find we've almost come back. The threat is different. They don't worry about a foreign adversary dropping a bomb. They just think we're going to do it to ourselves. The end result being essentially the same. And so I feel like my hurdle with my students is actually to overcome an apathy that kind of worldview generates, where I'm thinking about it from their perspective. I'm just like a young person. I have no political power. I have no money. And the adults in the room are just sinking the ship. Sorry for the mixed metaphor, but, they cannot be trusted here. And nobody's listening to me, nor do I have any power. And I find, to some extent, that turns into a kind of barrier to kind of this notion that you can engage the world and would want to engage the world, would want to know about it so you could engage more successfully. So I feel as though I don't need to sell them anymore on the dangers of global problems. And I'm especially now, I'd be very interested on, when I go back to the classroom, what the pandemic has done in the sense of a worldview of my students.
And don't forget, Lee, that during the pandemic lockdown here in Toronto, we had a nuclear panic, remember?
I do remember!
What a morning that was.
So we have a text system that can sort of be taken over by the government when there's kind of an emergency, and it's used mostly in child abduction cases. One morning, we all awoke to these messages going off saying that in Pickering, which is a small town not far at all when you're talking about nuclear power and radiation, not far at all from Toronto, it's actually the power plant that services all of Ontario, but especially Toronto. And they had some kind of radiation leak, which is all that the public was told. There's some kind of radiation leak. Don't worry about it.
It'll be fine.
It'll be fine.
Eat some seaweed.
Yeah. Stay inside. Remember Chernobyl. It'll all work out. No, they didn't put that in the text.
And then they sent us another text saying, nah, it's fine. Probably nothing.
I think it was an exercise in proactive communication where they didn't want people to discover after the fact that there might have been a problem, especially if it ended up being something that the authorities had to respond to. So they wanted to, I think, demonstrate, like, look, we're very upfront about this. Here's
nothing to hide.
Yeah, we don't know what's going on. It's probably safe, so just so you know. And then later they were like, yeah, nothing happened. So,
that's actually good because, I mean, that was a lot of the downfall in 3 Mile Island is that everybody thought they were keeping things from them.
Right.
Or in Canada's nuclear meltdown in Chalk River.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's on my list.
Are you coming? You're going to visit Chalk River?
Oh, it's on my list to talk to someone about Chalk River, but I could come to Chalk River and ask.
I know. Area 51, Chernobyl, Chalk River, I don't know. It's not even on the list. You asked earlier, like, why there were so many episodes about aliens, and it was actually the research for that just, it was like being punched in the stomach. It was so impactful because we mentioned it in the episode, I'm sure.
Actually, I said UFO. That's very different than aliens.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
Lee.
no, you're absolutely right. Yes, of course. Sorry. I just read an entire book. The last 2 chapters makes that single point, which is like, don't get those things confused. Of course, that's what I do. But no, Annie Jacobson's book, Area 51, and Captain or Lieutenant, I think it's Captain Ruppelt. So Ruppelt is this guy together with Dr. Hynek who's trying to make sense of all this aerial phenomena that doesn't make any sense, like these black triangles that are flying around. And then 60 years later, Annie Jacobson gets a hold of the declassified files and can put the pieces together. And again, it brought all of this UFO stuff into, for me, actually, I found it so compelling in part because a lot of these sightings, they were onto something really big. You were discovering by accident stuff that wasn't allowed to happen, was super secret. The Soviets were spending, I don't know how much money to try and figure it out. And then you just like stumbled into it by accident, and you saw it and you were this close, just millimeters away from something super secret. And so Area 51 has kind of a special place in my heart for that reason, because it was that moment where I could see the difficulties of trying to make sense of such a large-scale phenomenon. And I just loved the book, too. Jacobson's Area 51, I thought, was a lot of fun.
I have a lot of issues with that last chapter.
Yeah, no, the last chapter, I read somewhere else that it actually might be a moment of disinformation.
I think I said that to you.
Yeah, I think Nathan said that in the episode.
I read it. I just recently...
You're mistaking me for a book.
No,
which is easy to do.
Oh, I think you're like cribbing some stuff out of a book and calling it your own.
So all these conspiracy theories are coming out now, being that we're 60 years later and things that had been conspiracy theories with freedom of information are all coming out that you can look at the documentation and figure out what is truth and what was fiction. What do you anticipate coming out in 50 or 60 years from the war on terror? Do you think these same kind of shenanigans are going on now? Do you think there are adults in the room?
I think that what we're going to find out, maybe not even in 50 or 60 years, maybe hopefully in the next few years, is just the extraordinary extent to which we are being surveilled. I think that's going to be genuinely shocking, and some of that has already come out with Edward Snowden and these sort of whistleblowers who have pointed out that there have been these vast, overreaching programs from the NSA and from the FBI. And of course, there's a history of that. We've done an episode on COINTELPRO, which was a terrifying FBI program in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think that's where we're going to be truly shocked, is finding out just how much of our information was being mined and examined.
I take a bit of a different view here, maybe, than Nathan, because what I'm struggling to articulate is that I don't know if something has happened over the last 10, 20 years, and I don't know if the revelation of information in the future is going to have the same impact as the last set of revelations, say, over the last 20 years. I think there's been a kind of prevailing cynicism that's taken over, where I just expect my government now to be engaged in all kinds of nonsense. And I don't think I'd be shocked anymore. I don't know, like, honestly, without sounding too pessimistic, I don't know what could be revealed that would truly shock me anymore. I feel like I'm ready for it. I feel like, oh, your plan was, I don't know, to like annex half the world and use it for nuclear testing. Sure, that seems like something the US or China or Russia or whoever would do.
Oh, Lee, are you okay? Has this lockdown been going on too long?
No, I think there is something, like, with the revelations of Edward Snowden and with all of this kind of stuff, the three of us, I suspect, still come from a time of a certain amount of political naivete. And I think that's where my earlier reference to our Mayor Rob Ford and then later Donald Trump, our generation and older people thought, well, if you expose them to the public, if you expose their misdeeds to the public, things will happen, people will react, people will care. And we've gotten to the point now where it's like, yeah, whatever. Like, I'm not that it's not upsetting, but that I feel like, and I don't know if I'm misconstruing the past, but in this research, what we did discover was there was a sort of a break that happens in the 70s when suddenly all these revelations come out and you go from a kind of hokey, oh, my government is really out for my best interests, to a much more cynical, like, hold on a second, there are elements here, there's things going on that I'm not sure about. And that has just continued. Nathan mentioned surveillance. There's a book on my bookshelf, Surveillance Capitalism. I mean, we consent to this every day when we go on the internet, like, sure, whatever, I'll click my life away, take my children, whatever. And I don't even know if we will still be releasing documents in 50 or 60 years. I would be curious, because we have been talking recently about the recent set of UFO phenomena. And again, here Nathan and I differ somewhat. And I think that we're back in the 50s and 60s where, Area 51 test stuff was accidentally being seen by people. And I wonder, I think we will get clarity on a few puzzle pieces, and we might get more proof of things that we already expect. Like, I think I can say with pretty much certainty that the war on terror, there was a lot of torture, extrajudicial arrests, no habeas corpus. But we know all this. I mean, and those are the offenses. Now I guess I'll get more documentation about it.
And you'll learn the extent of it.
Yeah. But even there, can you shock me? I think it's pretty bad.
I worry that maybe we're still not cynical enough.
That's the kind of optimism you get on the Uncover Up.
Do you think that part of this is the circle of trust? It has widened over the past 20 or 30 years. So the government's using a lot more contractors instead of having just their core set of employees. There's a lot more information out there. There's a lot more people involved. And so it's hard to keep a conspiracy.
But see, what's interesting, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I think somebody came up with a mathematical equation to figure out, based on this many people need to know about this conspiracy, it will stay secret for only this long. The more people know, the less time it can stay as a conspiracy. But I think that we have a new method now of hiding conspiracies. Before, you would hide it with silence, and now you conceal it with noise. Now you just bury it so it's just more noise, and you can't pick out the signal from that noise.
And I think we're in a different realm now, too, I think, where a lot of the conspiracies that we are dealing with are not generated top-down. I mean, again, this might be, Shelley, to your point, where we get more revelations in the future, and some of the things I thought were just history ended up being nefarious conspiracy plots by people in power. But I think the conspiracy phenomenon today is a lot more anti-vax, QAnon, this conspiracy as a certain form of identity politics in which a kind of rage and alienation is being expressed in counter discourses. In the same way, like if I sit with a religious fundamentalist, we can't talk to each other because there's just so much that we don't agree on. I think this is what these discourses start to create, these other worlds in which people are kind of opting out of, and here I'm using scare quotes for people in podcast land, out of the mainstream, out of this culture created by sheeple, and they're waking up to the truth. And I feel like this has always been part of a conspiratorial discourse and landscape and history. But I felt like we had more of this kind of let's nuke the moon stuff in the 50s and 60s, and less stuff around the government is trying to inject me with nanobots that are going to change the way I think or make me infertile or something.
Or both.
Yeah, or both. And that's a change I think that begins in the 70s, where things like COINTELPRO and MKUltra, which were these CIA-led operations against American civilians, against either COINTELPRO was against mostly left-wing political organizations, and MKUltra was this kind of bizarre CIA attempt to create super soldiers, brainwash people, and stuff like that. I don't know how much of that is going to be revealed in the future.
So 2 things. One is instead of saying shoot for the moon, I'm going to start saying nuke the moon.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's nuke the moon.
Honey, don't shoot for the stars. Nuke the moon.
Nuke the moon.
That's right.
And 2, do you think there is any coincidence that people thinking that there are nanobots in their system coincides with people getting LSD?
Well, actually, we did an episode on this. The counterculture shows up in the United States about the same time the CIA was performing all these experiments in San Francisco and New York, where they were dosing people with acid. So it's sort of this weird unintended consequence. The CIA was trying to figure out methods of mind control and ended up instead with Jefferson Airplane.
Oh, it's really helpful that you sent out those questions. You asked some things which I realized I had never thought of before.
Oh, like what? Did we cover
Would
it?
the Cold War happen without nuclear weapons? I had to actually mull that over for a couple of days. It's like, that's because to me, they're almost interchangeable.
Yeah.
In a way. Sort of the era of nuclear war is just a more complicated way of saying the Cold War.
Well, I mean, look at it this way. If the Soviets didn't get the atomic bomb when they did, might the Americans have attacked the Soviet Union?
Why did we not use that as our example of crossover? Like how the Soviets got the bomb.
Oh, yeah.
There's like spies all the way down.
Oh, yeah.
Clearly, there is plenty more stuff to talk about. I want to talk about Project Pandora.
I want to go back to COINTELPRO.
But Project Pandora is nuclear.
What's Project Pandora?
Can microwaves be used for mind control?
Yes.
What? Yes, they can. Yes, they can.
No. I just...
What?
You heard it here first.
No. I just learned about Project Pandora reading the ARPA book.
Is that also Annie Jacobson?
No, I prefer this one to the Jacobson, actually. It's called The Imagineers of War.
Okay.
I'll give you a copy. I'll drop it off secretly in your mailbox, as I do.
I heard about that one because I'm like, ooh, this would have been good because they thought that the microwaves were giving low levels of radiation and that somehow it was harming the people in the state office in Moscow or wherever.
Oh, yes, that's a brilliant one.
My question is are they doing something similar to that in Cuba right now?
I don't know. It would be a very good episode, especially bringing it back to Cuba, even though Lee doesn't like doing modern stuff.
No,
It's true, admit it.
Well, it's true. Well, but the reason it's true is because one of the dangers we face in talking about conspiracies is that it's so popular and there's so much going on. And I feel like we don't actually know what's going on until you have some time. And I feel like it's a hard sell to be like, trust me, there's nothing here, but you're going to have to wait at least 50 years until we can prove it. So I like the other way around, where I'm like, look, this situation is a lot like today. And Nathan is always very good at setting the scene in a way where you're like, I can't explain this. And then sort of talking through, and that's what I love. I love knowing how the story ends. I hate this open-endedness, which is why I stay away from the contemporary stuff.
Which is why I was shocked when Lee was the one who said that we should do this recent UFO incident.
But the only reason I wanted to do it was because I'm like, this is the 50s all over again. I know we disagreed. This is like a fourth time now.
But here's what's great about it, from my perspective, is that we actually had to make predictions. Like, the report was going to be released basically right after we did the episode. And so Lee and Elena said the reasonable thing, and they said, we think this is actually going to turn out to be American tech, which 100% very reasonable, backed up by historical context and everything. And I said, I think it's going to be something else. And according to the report, which I'm sure is redacted and a lie, they said the only thing they know for sure about these UFOs, not American tech.
Okay, which is exactly what you would say if you were like suddenly broadcasting highly classified American tech all over the world. You're like, nah.
Yeah, that's why the whole report is just a complete exercise in futility.
Yeah. Well, welcome to my life.
Thank you for listening to another episode of My Nuclear Life, and thank you again to Nathan and Lee of The Uncover-Up. As mentioned earlier, the third episode linked is when we decided to come together again and discuss Project Seesaw, which was released on the Uncover-Up podcast a couple weeks ago. That will also be linked in the show notes. To learn more about our podcast, My Nuclear Life, or send us an email, head over to our website, mynuclearlife.com. I would also like to send out a special thanks to our Patreons, whose generous support keeps our webpage up and running. To be included in this fine list of people, head over to patreon.com, where we post extended conversations with our guests and send out exclusive merchandise. An easy way to support us is to leave a review or 5 stars wherever you listen to this podcast, and just tell a friend. Until next time, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.